All right, welcome everybody. Good evening. We are here for Being Lake Michigan's Neighbor. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. My name is Ryan Hellenbrand, and I am a librarian at the Glenview Public Library. Tonight we are joined by Cameron Davis, who was elected commissioner at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. In what was one of the most unusual races in Illinois history. He's running for re-election in the upcoming March 17th primary. From 2009 until 2017, he was President Obama's Great Lakes czar, coordinating the work of 11 federal departments and serving as the administration's liaison to Capitol Hill and investing more than $2 billion under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Cam has dedicated his entire career to the public's interest in water, having served as a litigating attorney for the National Wildlife Federation, professor at the University of Michigan Law School, and president and CEO of the Chicago-based Alliance for the Great Lakes. More about Cam's work can be found on camdavis.org, or you can follow him on Twitter at Aquavate. That's AQUAVATE. With that, please welcome Cameron Davis.
Great, thank you, Ryan. I'm going to go ahead and take it over here. Hopefully it'll work. And I should have gotten you an update to the bio. Thanks to many of you in Glenview and Evanston and parts around Cook County. I actually won in November, so I'm in for another 6 years, thanks to many of you. So don't worry about that re-election thing. I am sharing my screen right now, and I've put together a little bit of a presentation to just guide the discussion tonight. But one of the things that's really important to you in Glenview is you are what you drink, and that means you are Lake Michigan, because Lake Michigan is the drinking water source for Glenview, as it is for your neighbor where I am in Evanston and Wilmette, Chicago, and so many other communities here in the Chicago metro region. So if for no other reason than drinking water is important as our survival, Lake Michigan is something that we all care about. As Ryan mentioned, I've been doing Great Lakes work now for 35 years of my career, including right on up and as part of the Obama administration. And one of the things that I'll do for fun from time to time, I'm not going to do it tonight because we're all virtual, is ask for a show of hands of how many people do not like Lake Michigan or the Great Lakes. And never, not once, ever in my 35 years have I had a hand go up. We all love Lake Michigan. It's part of who we are. It's part of our identity, and something that is really unique. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but it is the largest lake within the US. Our very humble Lake Michigan, which we motor down Lakeshore Drive looking at, which we go to the park or the beach looking at, is the largest lake within the United States, wholly within US borders. Of course, we share other Great Lakes with Canada, but Lake Michigan is completely within US borders, making it the largest lake within our boundaries. And we often forget that. I want to chat a little bit tonight about lake levels, something that's been in the news recently. The Great Lakes and Lake Michigan, what it takes to help protect them, and some of the efforts that we've had over the past few years and continue to have. And then just a little bit about the Chicago River system as well, which Glenview is part of it because of your neighborliness with the north branch of the Chicago River system. So let's do this, a little bit of a trivia question. I want to find out, and Ryan, we could do this by survey or chat, whatever works. I'd like to see if folks would be willing to take a guess at what year these pictures were taken.
Yeah, feel free to go ahead and submit a chat if you want to answer, yeah.
All right, well, if you don't mind doing it, I'm afraid if I move off of the slide, it'll take me 3 years to get back to it. What years, and you can tell me what you see, Ryan, if you're able to do it.
I have a 1982 so far, 1970s so far. Let's see, what's my guess? These are taken in the same, these are the same time period?
No, they're not.
Oh, oh boy.
Good question. I usually don't I don't allow counter questions, but Ryan, for you, I'm doing it.
1990,
Anyway,
another guess came in.
okay, good. All very respectable. Okay, so the one on the right was taken in the 1980s, in the mid 1980s. I don't have an exact year for it, but it was 86 or 87 during the period of high lake levels. During that time, there was a tremendous education push, excuse me, a tremendous education push to get people to build back and even relocate their homes away from the lake. Why? Because lake levels go up, lake levels go down. They are not static. And because lake levels fluctuate, that has an impact on the coast. And if you build too close to the lake, this is the kind of thing that happens. So that was the mid 1980s on the right. On the left, you would think that we would have learned our lessons, but that happened last year. And these were taken, of course, in Michigan. We really don't have we do have high bluffs on the Illinois border, in Highland Park and Lake Bluff and some of our northern suburbs, but nothing like this. Either way, it's a pretty dramatic look at the power that fluctuating lake levels have. Whenever lake levels go up, people scurry to try to protect their homes. When lake levels go down, they want to build their homes or other structures right up next to the water, forgetting that only a matter of years or even a decade or two before that, people were trying to move their homes back and paying large bills to do those kinds of things. So for those of you who have places or know people with lakefront homes, particularly on the other side of the lake, may this be a warning. Why do lake levels go up and down? But more importantly, what's behind the latest lake levels? We have seen just this past year record monthly high lake levels in Lake Michigan. It's been in the news, up and down, left and right, everything from the local papers, the Sun-Times, the Trib, all the way up to the New York Times and national news, because it can have quite an impact when those lake levels go way up, and they keep going up. So why has that been happening? I'm going to give you a little bit of a tutorial about Lake Michigan and our recent high lake levels, but what I'm about to talk about can really be applied to virtually any other lake. Here is a hydrograph from October of last year for Lake Superior. And what you see, if you can see my cursor, is, and oh, by the way, I should have mentioned this at the outset, Ryan, I really have a hard stop at 7:40, so I'm going to wrap up by about 7:25, 7:30, so we have time for Q&A. I apologize for shortchanging you by 15 minutes. I learned tonight I have to get my son to the high school, so I have to do that. Anyway, here's what a normal cycle looks like for Lake Superior. What you see is in the fall and winter months, lake levels start to edge down. Ryan, can you see my cursor and how it's moving along the red line?
I can, yes.
Great. Okay, so lake levels start to move down in the fall and winter time. That makes sense. It's usually a little drier. We have a lot of evaporation out of the lakes in the winter time. And then in the springtime, you start to see those lake levels go back up. Again, it's pretty intuitive. April showers bring May flowers. We get a lot of spring rains. It's also time for winter runoff as ice and snow melts like we're seeing now in the month of March. That leads to more water flowing into tributaries, which then flow into Lake Superior. And then you see the cycle start to repeat itself. Come the fall, and into winter, you see lake levels drop. And then come the summer months, you see lake levels, spring and summer, you see those lake levels go back up. So that's a fairly normal hydrograph. That's a fairly normal series of seasonal cycles for one of our Great Lakes, Lake Superior. Let's move on to the Great Lake Erie. And you see an even more pronounced cycle that's very similar. Springtime, lake levels go up as the wet spring and the snow runoff melt, enter the lake. And then comes summer, when it's usually hot and dry. No surprise there. Water is leaving the system through evaporation until you get back to that fall winter zone, and into the spring when lake levels go back up again. Again, you see that very pronounced hydrograph, that very pronounced cycle of ups and downs. Okay, now we're going to our favorite Great Lake, at least if you live close to it. And here's your second trivia question. What two Great Lakes are actually one lake? Anybody want to hazard to guess? Ryan, do we see any answers?
Yeah, if you have a guess, Helen says Huron and Michigan.
You got it, Helen. You won that one. Lakes Michigan and Huron are actually one lake. They are connected through the Straits of Mackinac, which is why you see the Corps of Engineers hydrograph here say Lakes Michigan, Huron, because they basically have the same water levels because they're the same lake. Look at this hydrograph. Okay, come spring in 2019, we see the wet spring start to translate into higher lake levels. Wet spring in 2020, higher lake levels. But go back and look in time at the summer months going into the fall. Usually we have hot, dry summers, which lead to evaporation of billions of gallons of water out of the lake. In 2019, it stayed relatively flat. Why is that? Well, those of you who stuck around for the summer and fall of 2019 and were not off somewhere else, traveling because we could do that then without worrying about a pandemic, you may remember that we had an incredibly wet summer and an incredibly wet fall. We continued to have rain very consistently through those summer months. So what happened in Lake Michigan was, at a time when you normally would see that red line dip down because of evaporation, the lake never had the chance to correct itself. That normal cycle of evaporation never really happened. So what happened was, in early 2019, lake levels went up, they stayed relatively flat, and then they went up again. And as a result, we had record high monthly lake levels last year. We beat our previous records from the mid-1980s. You'll recall that picture that I showed of one of the houses falling in the mid-1980s. That's because of those high lake levels. So that's what you see when the next time you're at a cocktail party, or the next time you're at one of your kids' sporting events and you just happen to be talking about Lake Michigan. You can now be a great expert on lake levels, because you know that there are what I call the two shuns that influence lake levels. There's precipitation and then there's evaporation. And when you have a lot of precipitation and you don't have a lot of evaporation, that's a recipe for lake levels staying high. When you have a lot of evaporation but not a lot of precipitation, that's a recipe for lake levels starting to go down. And lake levels have been going down. Some of you may remember that this past summer in 2020, we actually had a fairly normal cycle. In other words, it really didn't rain. It may not have been that hot in the scheme of things, but it was pretty dry. And that is translating into lake levels edging downward now. There is that kind of 6-month lag time because the system is so big between what happens with precipitation and evaporation and what actually happens and how it translates into lake levels. Now, we all know what precipitation looks like. It comes in the form of snow, it comes in the form of rain, but have any of you seen evaporation? That's what evaporation looks like. On October 2nd of this past year, after dropping my son at the high school for his swimming practice, at about 6 o'clock in the morning, I took this picture looking out over Lake Michigan to the east. You can see the sunrise starting to happen over Michigan. This, what you see here in the sky, that's billions of gallons of water evaporating out of the lake. And it makes sense. If you have a frying pan on your stove and you've turned on the stove and you take some water and drop it into the pan, what happens? It sizzles and it evaporates out of the pan. That's what's happening in the fall with our lakes. You have lakes that are still relatively warm from the summer months, but you have the air cooling very quickly in the fall months. And that means billions of gallons of water basically rising out of the lake, going up into the sky, and often pushing eastward through those dominant wind currents, which is part of why the lower peninsula of Michigan can often be so cloudy. Anyway, this is what evaporation looks like. I bet you've never seen evaporation before, and now you have tonight. And you can thank the Glenview Public Library for showing you what evaporation looks like to the human eye. Lake levels can mean a great deal to safety as well. In the past couple of years, there was an incident out in the lake where, because of high lake levels, jetties that are built perpendicularly from the lake out into the lake were covered in water. And there was an incident where some young people were driving their boat very fast and didn't see a submerged jetty, and the boat ran right into it. And those folks got hurt pretty badly. In fact, I think a couple of them actually died. We also have currents in the lake near those jetties that can make swimming very difficult when the lake levels are pretty high. So, here, because we live in such a populated area, it's only natural that we'll have, more casualties from lake levels than in other less populated lakes. But still, it's a really important warning that these lakes are nothing to mess with, particularly when lake levels go up. And even when lake levels are really far down, you can ground your boat or, run into other problems. So that's a little bit about lake levels. Lake quantity, let's call it. Let's turn to quality. What about how healthy the lakes are? One of the top questions that I get all the time. How healthy are the lakes? Well, the short answer is they are getting healthier in some ways, and in other ways, we still have some pretty big challenges. We have toxic hotspots around the Great Lakes, about 30 what we call areas of concern. We have invasive species that have both gotten into the Great Lakes and are threatening to get into the Great Lakes, like Asian carp. One of the things that I spent probably 25% of my time on while working for the federal government was keeping bighead and silver carp out of the Great Lakes as they moved upstream in the Illinois River system. And I'm glad to talk about that if there are any questions. Polluted runoff. One of the things that some of you may remember is in August of 2014, the greater Toledo metro area had to shut their public water supply down for the first weekend in August 2014. Why is that? That's because toxic algae was growing. There were several reasons for it, but one of them was toxic algae was growing out of control in the western basin of Lake Erie. That was largely a function of polluted runoff from farms. that made their way down the Maumee River system, the largest tributary to any of the Great Lakes that runs through Toledo, and essentially wound up in Lake Erie. In other words, when fertilizer is applied upstream to grow crops, if there's too much of it and you have a wet spring that washes excess fertilizer off farm fields downstream, it means that that fertilizer doesn't just fertilize crops anymore. It can fertilize algae in the lake downstream. And too much algae and too much of the wrong kind can be very, very dangerous. So polluted runoff is another big threat. Habitat loss is another big threat. We have converted a lot of our Midwest away from wetlands and marshes to agricultural areas. We have some of the most fertile soil anywhere in the world, perfect for growing crops. But in order to create more of that very fertile land, we have filled in a lot of our wetlands, which provide myriad benefits. They provide fish and wildlife habitat. They act as sponges to help soak up rainwater. They also improve water quality as well. So all of those things combined mean that wetlands are one of the most valuable kinds of ecosystems that we have anywhere around the world. And we have lost a lot of them here in the Great Lakes region and need to get them back. Education and science and climate change are other threats to the Great Lakes. We have to educate people to be able to make better decisions. We have to have great science. All of those are underpinnings to fighting climate change, which, as I mentioned, before, in the context of fluctuating lake levels, is having a real impact on the Great Lakes. I should mention, when climate change rears its head, one of the first places that we see the effects of climate change taking place is on our water resources, on lake levels. And so it's no coincidence that we have a warming atmosphere and that is creating climatological impacts on the Great Lakes. The good news is we have a program called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that has been pouring billions of dollars into the restoration of our beloved Great Lakes. So, for example, our toxic hotspots that I mentioned before, the best example of one of those areas of concern is Waukegan Harbor. And I got to imagine everybody on the Zoom tonight knows where Waukegan is and knows that Waukegan Harbor has been polluted in the past. In fact, the media in the 1970s called it the world's worst PCB mess. PCBs, of course, are highly toxic compounds, and about half of the sediment, 500,000 parts per million of that harbor sediment was comprised of PCBs. That's how polluted it was, the world's worst PCB mess. As of about 6-7 years ago, that cleanup was completed as a result of several programs, one of which was the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Another one that many of you may be familiar with is the Grand Calumet River, which runs through Northwest Indiana. If you're ever driving over the Skyway, you cross over the Grand Calumet River and can see where restoration has been taking place. At one point, 90% of the Grand Calumet River was comprised of wastewater. 90% of the flow of that river was comprised of discharges from factories and municipalities. It is a place that it has been enormously contaminated, and the cleanup of which has been extremely expensive. It's been one of these places where in my previous job, I would often hear, this place will never get cleaned up in my lifetime. Well, places like Waukegan Harbor have been cleaned up. Places like the Grand Calumet River are being cleaned up, and they will be finished within our lifetimes, assuming that we live another 10 years. That is a far cry from being concerned that places like that would never get cleaned up. And that is largely a function of solid enforcement, but also programs like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. This program has been funded at about $300 million per year since the year 2010. The 3 of the past 4 years, the Trump administration had proposed to all but eliminate the program. Fortunately, a bipartisan Congress stepped in to say, nope, this program is getting results. We are not gonna axe this program. We're gonna keep it around, which was and is one of the most important lessons I can convey to anybody who cares about the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes and the protection of them has always been, and it always must be, a nonpartisan issue. It doesn't matter what party you identify with. If you identify with any party at all, we drink the water, we go to the beach, we recreate around the Great Lakes. It is the lifeblood. The Great Lakes are the lifeblood of our region, and their protection is paramount, which is why this program has survived lots of whipsaws in Washington, D.C. When it was first proposed, there was a Democrat in the White House, and Democrats controlled the Congress. Then it shifted. Republicans controlled Congress, and there was a Democrat still in the White House. Then it shifted again. There was a Republican in the White House with a Republican-controlled Congress. Then it shifted again. We had a Republican in the White House and a democratically controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate. Now we, of course, have Democrats controlling all 3. Through all of that, this program has survived. And that's the reason, because we all care about the Great Lakes, and we have kept the Great Lakes a nonpartisan issue. That was a big part of my job when I worked for federal government, and it was a large part of why we were able to keep this program around. We need to keep it around in the future. The Chicago River system, which is something that we often forget about because it's often overshadowed by the vastness of Lake Michigan, is a really important waterway within our region. At the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, where I serve as a commissioner, we are combating flooding around the Chicago River system, particularly in disproportionately impacted communities. Poorer communities have a difficult time being able to reduce and prevent flooding than more wealthy communities, and that is something we are trying to combat on the board level at the Water Reclamation District. We have a tremendous problem with combined sewer overflows, and that is when we have large rain events. We run out of storage capacity to be able to store the water that runs off of our streets and comes out of our factories and flushes through our homes. In that case, that water has to bypass our storage and go straight into the Chicago River system. Obviously, that's not something we want to see happening. It's something that there's been a lot of progress on over the years, but as we see wetter and wetter weather, that is creating a dynamic where essentially the goalposts are being moved on MWRD, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. Hard to believe, but this picture was taken basically almost right across the river from Lane Tech in Chicago. You would almost think that this was a picture from a prairie along the Missouri River in the Dakotas or something like that. But this picture was actually taken downtown, which is a great reminder to me. I'm always inspired by this picture. It's a great reminder that we are working very hard to bring shoreline habitat back to the Chicago River system so we can beautify it, but it also has a lot of very pragmatic value to it as well as habitat to help store rainwater. We need to be in the position where we are using landscape as a sponge, because we cannot build enough tunnels, we cannot build enough reservoirs to hold all the water that comes our way. And I already mentioned equity a little bit, especially in the context of flooding, where we are trying to make sure that we have equity and we're treating all of our communities fairly in terms of helping to protect them against flooding and to help ensure environmental quality is paramount. Looking forward and outward, one of the things that I daydream about is what we would like the Lake Michigan coast to be like in 25, 50, or 100 years. What do we want the Chicago River system to look like? And I invite you to daydream about that too, because the further out we think and the more we reconnect to our waterways, whether it's Lake Michigan or the Chicago River system, the higher the quality of life that we will see in our region. Here are some websites and some resources for those folks who would like to dig into this a little bit more. I often feel like I should start my own Oprah book club because I get asked what good books are worth reading about the Great Lakes. So I've listed a couple down here. One of them is The Death and Life of the Great Lakes by Dan Egan. Dan is a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, has both authors for that matter, have a brilliant way of being able to distill complex scientific information into a very readable story. And the same is true of the Great Lakes Water Wars by Peter Annan, a former reporter for US News and World Report, who wrote about the region's mismatch between its impression that we have an overabundance of water because the Great Lakes are so big, and yet the wastefulness of water in our region as well. Both of them are excellent reads, highly recommend it. Death and Life of the Great Lakes covers a whole bunch more issues from Asian carp to climate change, whereas Water Wars is really about diversions into and out of the Great Lakes and how water moves. Both very fascinating reads, highly recommend them. And then please do reach out. This is my email address at MWRD. You elected me as one of your commissioners, so I am a public servant and want to make sure that I'm helping. One common request that we get, and I want to invite you to think about this, is if you would ever like to tour one of the Water Reclamation District's treatment plants, it's really cool. I highly recommend you do it. There's one at McCormick and Howard called the O'Brien Water Reclamation Plant. So about a 20-minute drive from Glenview. Once we get open houses going again, they're typically in mid-May, but this year I haven't heard news that we're going to do an in-person one. I'd like to invite you to be in touch to go on one of those open houses. If you want a private tour, or if you have a school class that would like a tour, those can be arranged too. Again, once we're back out of pandemic mode. In the meantime, there are virtual tours that are conducted online that are also really, really good, and I highly recommend. And then please do follow me on Aquavate on Twitter. If you have a Twitter account, I picked this name because I felt like it is important for all of us to activate for our water. So that's why I came up with Aquavate. So we all need to be activists. I'll close with this final short story. The picture that you see here was taken at Diversey Harbor in Chicago, and it was taken in October of 2012 when Superstorm Sandy was battering the East Coast. Another great reminder that our lakes, although big, are very fragile and powerful all at the same time. So with that, Ryan, I am going to stop, and I'm happy to entertain questions for the next several minutes.
Yeah, we have a few minutes left. If you have any questions, you can submit in the Q&A, but we do have a few already. So Helen asks, do floodgates like on Des Plaines River Road cause problems, or are they a good solution to handling flooding problems? Are they effective?
Yeah, they can be very effective, Helen, at slowing water down. So they are part of the solution. We also have gates at Wilmette. For those of you who've driven around the Baha'i Temple, you go over a bridge over the North Shore Channel. There are some gates under that bridge that connect the Chicago River system to the lake. There's some in the Navy Pier area, and then there's some on the south side. Whenever we get heavy rainstorms, the last resort of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District is to open those gates to relieve pressure, high water level pressure in the Chicago River system, and let it go out into the lake. So gates can be very effective at least temporarily controlling water levels. I do see the next question here. Would it help on high rain days for people to make it a low flow day in their homes, flush less often, do less laundry? Could there be announcements asking for this across the area? It is absolutely helpful. In fact, you can sign up. Friends of the Chicago River has a program called Overflow Action Day, where if we know a heavy rainstorm is coming, they will alert you that you should reduce your use of water in the home if you can. Running the dishwasher, flushing less, delaying showers, delaying doing the laundry, all of that can help. You heard me mention before combined sewer overflows. Well, if during big rain events, we can hold off on using water in our homes to the extent we can, all of us chipping in and doing that will make a big difference. So Mary, thank you for asking that question. Overflow Action Days by Friends of the Chicago River is a great notification for people to be aware of. Helen, you asked another question. Can we ever get rid of zebra mussels or other invasive species in the lake? I'm struggling to answer this one because right now the answer is no, but it's possible that the answer could be yes on a limited basis in the future. The U.S. Geological Survey has been experimenting with a way to essentially limit the propagation of zebra mussels and quagga mussels, their more powerful cousin. That work is being experimented on right now. There have been a few bench scale studies that have shown some early success. But how effective it can be on a mass scale, I don't think we know. But it is a very good question because zebra and quagga mussels have basically sucked or are sucking the lower echelon of the food web out of the Great Lakes, which of course all the other echelons above that rely on for food, namely plankton. So you are right, and we are right to be concerned about invasive species. You go to the Chesapeake and soft shell crab is part of the Chesapeake region's identity. You go to the Pacific Northwest and Pacific and salmon are part of the Pacific Northwest's identity. Here in the Midwest, we have whitefish and we have yellow perch. Some people call them lake perch. Those are part of our identity, and they have been hit hard because food has been removed from the system as a result of zebra mussels and quagga mussels. Bottom line is, once invasive species are in, they are very difficult to get rid of. You want to keep them from getting in that first place. Preventing them from getting in is really the only effective measure, which is why the fight against Asian carp is so important. Those are the three questions that I see, Ryan, on the screen. If there are any others, I'm happy to entertain them.
Do you have time right now? There are no more in the Q&A.
I have time for about one more.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I think you're, well, I mean, do you have any what's the future for Lake Michigan? Do you see any, what's the big thing you see coming up?
Right now, there is an effort to try to increase funding for programs like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Now, I know a lot of us, and I have been guilty in my past of feeling this way, that, when you want to work on saving the lakes, you want to work on the ground and do the substantive work. But these budgets really matter. And so I do see a big effort coming up wherein we need to push for greater funding to help accelerate restoration even more. I will tell you that the congressional delegation in our part of the world, in the northern suburbs, and in the Chicago metro region for that matter, have been very supportive of that program. So it really doesn't take any convincing from our federal elected officials.
All right, Ken. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming out tonight and talking about this very important issue. I hope everybody learned a lot and knows what we have at stake moving forward. So I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you. And please do reach out if anybody decides they have questions after I hang up. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you, everybody, for being such a great audience.
No problem. Take care.